Hi everyone. Just wanted to give you a few details on your quiz for this past week. Don't mind my massive sunburn. I ran a race yesterday and was out in the sun all day. Um, so we will. I'll start with. There's actually two questions that I'm going to give you credit for. Um, I myself, I know the answers, but I had trouble finding them in the material. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you credit, but I do want to go over the information. So the first one was medical malpractice cases account for the majority of the tort litigation in the United States. Most everybody answered true because one would think that would be the case, but the actual correct answer was false. There's so many other items that actually fall within tort litigation, product liability, a lot of other areas. That fall within tort litigation. So med mal cases are not actually the majority. There's a whole heck of a lot of them, one would think, um, but it's actually it's not. The answer is false in that case. But I will go through. I haven't done that quite yet. I'll do that here shortly. But I will give you credit for that question. Another one had to do with torts. The plaintiff in a tort suit can seek compensation of the following two types. And there were several answers. The correct answer was compensatory damages and non economic costs. So compensatory damages are what it sounds like, compensation for what was lost. So um, recouping your damages. Non-economic costs are things that don't have a specific economic cost. So like pain and suffering, which was actually one of the other items that was on there as an option, but that's a non-economic cost. So things like that don't have a specific cost associated, um, but uh, but can be paid out. You'll see that often in a med mal case, that people will get a small amount for their compensatory damages. Maybe they paid $50,000 for the services, so they'll get that $50,000 back, or their insurance company will. But then they'll get $5 million in compensatory damages, or hence the reason for tort reform. Maybe they'll only get $250,000 because they're trying to create tort reform so that they can make changes in this, so there aren't the millions and millions of dollars paid out in non-economic costs. So that's what this compensatory damages and non-economic costs are, the compensation of two types that can be picked up by a plaintiff in a tort suit. The one other one that I did want to talk about, that was missed quite often, had to do with EMTALA obligations. So the question was, it's a true-false question. So true or false, the hospital's EMTALA obligation continues after the patient is diagnosed with an emergency medical condition and is admitted as an inpatient for further treatment. This obligation continues until the patient is discharged from the hospital. So was this true or false? The majority of students answered true, but that's actually false. The hospital's EMTALA obligation only continues until the patient's stable. So once the patient is stable, even if they've been admitted as an inpatient, they could technically be transferred, discharged. They can actually transfer the patient if they're unstable, but only under very certain circumstances. They would have to be transferring them to a facility that provides a higher level of care, perhaps. If your facility, maybe I work at a facility that doesn't have a burn center and this patient was burned badly, you needed to transfer them to that higher level of care. Or perhaps my facility, for example, the facility I worked at, one of the facilities I worked at was a tertiary care center. We accepted EMTALA transfers quite often from facilities that required trauma surgery, because they just didn't do it in those places. So they would send their patients to us. Now those patients were very unstable. They would come via helicopter, but those were EMTALA transfers. So those were unstable patients, but they were transferring them because they simply couldn't provide that care. However, this would be a situation where patient is admitted, they become stable, but they are an inpatient. Now, technically, the EMTALA obligation is over and done. Um, but most hospitals are not just going to send that patient out on the street. Now, your EMTALA obligation is over. However, there are other obligations that you would have to that patient. You cannot abandon a patient. So your EMTALA obligation is over, but you still cannot simply abandon a patient. You do not want to fall within that situation of abandonment. So your EMTALA obligation may be over, but you would not want to be abandoning a patient. You may, however, transfer them to a public hospital if they are unable to pay, if that's a situation that you have the opportunity to do. But most hospitals, honestly, just keep the patient until they are ready for discharge. But that's not a requirement. Once your EMTALA obligation is met, once the patient is stable, they could technically be discharged. But honestly, it's not really something that happens very often. Most hospitals have financial assistance programs and policies in place that would allow you to keep a patient until they are ready to go home, either to another facility or another care setting. So, which is good. That's not a bad thing that we're able to do that for patients. So those were kind of the top 3 questions. If you did have issues with any other questions, please let me know. I'm happy to go over that. This week is a really interesting week. I enjoy this week of the class. We're going to talk about Terry Schiavo. We're going to talk about a couple other things that are real ethical questions in this element of the course. And like I do say in the I said in the announcement, be sure to look at everything. This is a law and ethics class, so be sure to look at a lot of these discussions and whatnot with a kind of with an ethical lens. Don't just look at it. This is a business program. This is an administration program, but we always like with this EMTALA question. Yeah, the law says we can discharge that patient, but from an ethical perspective, we're not going to throw that patient. We're not going to abandon them. We're not going to throw them out on the street. I'm sure there are probably some administrators, especially the ones that are counting the beans, that would want to say, "Oh, there aren't enough beans to keep that patient here." But most administrators are not, from an ethical perspective, not going to want to toss that patient to the street. So try and look at things from the ethical perspective, and try and look at both sides of it, because oftentimes there is a balance that we need to look at. What is just isn't always legal, and sometimes what's legal isn't always just. So that's like with this EMTALA situation, that's not ethical, but it's legal. So we need to balance those things as well. So look forward to working with everybody this week in the discussion boards. And like I said, any questions, just let me know. Have a great week, everyone.